Welcome back. All right, so it is that time of year yet again. The Toronto Maple Leafs, they get out of the first round, so that's an improvement. But because of the way that the second round turns out, it doesn't feel like it's enough improvement. Now, I want to start by saying, but analytics say, and this is something I know the Timo Meyer argument I've had too with Devils fans. If a player is paid to score goals and assists, all the rest of the stuff is great. All the rest of it is great. And if the analytics say a guy's playing really well, awesome. But if your team doesn't win and that player doesn't get goals and assists, that's a problem. So when I see, well, Matthew Tkachuk didn't score a goal against Toronto either, my answer is, yeah, but Matthew Tkachuk had assists. He was driving the play. He was forcing turnovers, and Florida won. And they were the better team as a whole. And yes, you can look at the analytics, you can high danger chances, all that. And this is why I say, like, analytics are part of the story. Analytics are just, they tell you part of it. And I think with analytics, it works really well for people who, you don't watch the games, and maybe you're looking at these charts. And again, I follow analytics, I support analytics, but they're part of the picture. To me, they're part. And the Leafs are a good example of a team that analytically works, but practically hasn't. And so there has to be some sort of a change. Now, I don't know if it's going to be Kyle Dubas. I don't know. For all I know, Dubas could just say, you know what? I can't make this work in Toronto, and maybe he shops himself somewhere else. He didn't have a contract beyond this season. Sheldon Keefe could be out of a job. Absolutely, he could be. There have definitely been moments where Keefe, I know, has lost his cool behind the bench, and I'm thinking to myself, I understand why he's upset, but he's got to knock it off. And it's something with Michael Bunting, too. I understand Bunting being upset with a lot of the things that happen, but if you yell at the officials constantly, and if it feels like you're trying to show them up, you're not going to get those calls. Something has to change with the Leafs because the way they're built, it hasn't worked. So they finished with a record of 50, 21, and 11. They had 111 points, which was down 4 from last year. They've had ridiculous point totals. They've also been in the Atlantic Division where the competition's really tough. And we can make the argument about how far they would have gone in another division. The problem is 2021 knocked that right down. Here's the thing. 2020, we had the bubble playoffs. Edmonton had the West, Toronto had the East. And I remember the argument being, well, Toronto gets the bubble because they want Toronto to win the Stanley Cup. And then they were out in the qualifying round. It was the same thing with Edmonton. Oh, well, Edmonton, that's because they want Connor McDavid to win the Cup out in the qualifying round. 2021, oh, they have a Canadian division. This is just so the Leafs will end up in the conference final. Leafs are out in the first round. So this is where we're at, the Leafs have had situations where they should have won and they haven't. So we'll go all the way back to the first year with Matthews, which was 2016, 2017. They had a points percentage of .579. Very good points percentage. They were third in their division. They lost Game 6 at home to finish that series against Washington 2-1 in overtime. And coming out of that series, there was tons of optimism in Toronto. It wasn't a matter of if they'll win a cup, it's how many. That was the year that the channel starts growing, and I noticed in the comment section Leafs and Oilers fans arguing over which one of them was going to win more Stanley Cups. It was not, well, we think we'll win and you won't. It was, we think both of us are going to win. And so that optimism kind of gets lopped off a bit in 2017, 2018. Their points percentage gets better, 640. They're still third in the division. They lost Game 7 on the road against Boston, 7-4. And that was a rough loss for Toronto. And I remember being quite surprised at that score. 2018, 2019, they finished with a 610 points percentage, third in the division. And they lost Game 7 on the road at Boston, again, 5-1. Now, that year, I predicted that Toronto could win that Game 7. I felt like, they've got the experience now, and now it's time for them to show that, yeah, they can perform in the playoffs. And they lost 5-1. Then in 2019-2020, a .579 points percentage, third in the division. And they lost Game 5 in the bubble, and I couldn't put at home because it's bubble playoffs. Everybody played in the same places, against Columbus 3-0. And that one hurt. And I remember coming out of that one, the complaints being about goaltending when they got shut out, which I thought was odd. And in games where they get eliminated, 1 goal, 4 goals, 1 goal, 0 goals, and then 2020, 2021, they managed 3 in that loss in Game 7 at home against the Montreal Canadiens. A series they led 3-1, and they lost in 7, and they lost by a score of 4-3. In a series, they lost 4-3. Last year, they had a 701 points percentage. Second in the division. That was after they were first in the division in 2021. Again, the Canadian division built to get Toronto a win or Edmonton a win, and Montreal is the team that comes out of that division. But they were second last year, and then they lost Game 7 at home against Tampa 2-1, which was tough. And that series, I remember there was a lot of complaining about the officiating then and how the officiating favored Tampa. Now this year they got past Tampa in the first round. And again, from an analytics perspective, Tampa was the better team. However, Toronto won the series. This series, analytics could show Toronto was better in a lot of situations, but Florida wins Game 5. And that's at home. Again, Toronto loses 3-2 this time in overtime, right? So a 677 points percentage. Again, their regular season numbers have been very good, and they're second in their division. They had home ice advantage again. They had home ice advantage in both the first and second round because Boston got knocked out. It's interesting, too, because I wonder how the conversation would be different if Boston had held on to that series and beaten Florida, and if Boston had knocked out Toronto. Because my fear had been that if Boston knocked out Florida and then knocked out Toronto, that the argument would be, well, Toronto just beat a team in Tampa that was really tired and really beat up and injured, and once they played a real team, they were out. And of course, as Boston, it'd be the same argument that we've had. So they've now lost series against Washington, Boston, Columbus, Montreal, Tampa, and Florida. So it's not just because, again, it felt like for a while there the argument was, well, Boston's going to knock them out. And that's not really been the problem. They haven't met Boston in the last 4 years. But beating Tampa Bay was, I thought, a good accomplishment. They won games 3, 4, and 6 on the road, all in overtime. And it felt like Toronto took some steps forward. And then in this series, Florida just knew how to beat them. Morgan Rielly had a goal and 3 assists, might have been their best player. Nylander, 2 goals and an assist, all around the net. And I'm not going to take anything away from Nylander in terms of the effort, but the results just don't add up. And this is the problem. And Marner, 1 goal, 2 assists. Matthews, 2 assists. Matthews had a good series, didn't score. So you can talk about a guy having a good series, but if you don't get the goals and the assists, it doesn't matter. I am sure if you went back through NHL history and if you were able to get all the analytics on everything, you'd probably be quite surprised at teams that analytically weren't necessarily good, that had results in the playoffs, and teams that analytically might have been terrible and had that success, and then teams that were good analytically that ended up losing in the playoffs. There you go. Trying to get that. Anyway, a little bit awkward, but you guys know what I mean. And so the interesting thing to me was that Wall's save percentage of .921 betters Samsonov's .892 at the time he gets hurt. Goaltending is going to be a question mark with this team now, and it was a question mark coming into the season. And one thing that was said about Kyle Dubas was that when he brought in Matt Murray, he brought in Ilya Samsonov, however the goaltending works out could decide his fate. Murray ends up being hurt come playoff time, didn't play a minute. Samsonov gets hurt in the playoffs, had good moments and bad moments. And so if you're going to go by the goaltending, do you qualify that as a pass or a fail? And if it's a fail, if you say, well, Murray and what he did wasn't good enough, then it's a fail, and then that would reflect on Keith. Now, their UFA and RFA lists are interesting. I have to say, this every year it feels like the Toronto videos when they get knocked out get a little more interesting. Their UFA list is a long one. So Bunting, I don't think they can afford to bring back Bunting. O'Reilly, just a pure rental. I don't think he comes back. Kampf, I think they'll keep Kampf. I'd be very surprised if Kampf doesn't stick around. I would say the same of Noel Acciari. Good depth players. And again, with other ones that I've done, I see people get worked up like, well, why are they going to keep that guy? Because you have to have depth players. And sometimes it's not, a player who's got all kinds of goals and points. You got to have your depth guys there as well. And it's important to have depth guys with experience. Wayne Simmons, I think Simmons is probably going to retire. I'd be kind of surprised if he didn't. He's passed 1,000 games. He spent time in the AHL this year. I think he's probably going to retire. Aston Reese, may go, may stay. Kerfoot, probably gone. Hall, if they re-sign Hall, I know that the comment section will not be happy. That being said, I think Hall takes more criticism than he should. I think that Hall maybe has been deployed incorrectly in Toronto, which may reflect on Sheldon Keefe, but I understand the negativity around him. Luke Schenn, I thought looked great. Luke Schenn, I thought looked fantastic for Toronto, and I think they should try to find a way to hold on to him. Gustafsson. I want to talk a bit about Gustafsson. So at the time that the Sandin trade took place, there were Leaf fans who said, hey, Sandin's gone, that problem's gone. Sandin, it just wasn't working out. Sandin has a really good run with Washington, though. And that trade looks like a win because Gustafsson, where was Gustafsson? They traded Sandin, a good young defenseman, to get back Gustafsson, and I thought they'd use him more than they did. If it was just about acquiring depth on the blue line, I don't understand the trade of Sandin because Sandin is only going to get better. And what he showed in Washington was, if given the ice time and played correctly and with the right mix, he can be really, really effective. And then from a goaltending perspective, Shalgren's a UFA. I don't think they were going to bring back Shalgren anyways. I just thought it was worthy of putting him on the board. And then restricted free agent Samsonov. So Samsonov, I would think sticks around, right? I think they'll try to find a taker for Matt Murray. I would be very surprised if Matt Murray's back next year, but they've surprised me before. And I say very surprised only because their cap space for next year is $7,456,050 according to Cap Friendly. Now, that may include Jake Muzzin. Jake Muzzin, there's a real possibility he won't play again. That's been a discussion as to whether or not he will play again, whether or not his career might be finished. And so that would add some more money, but they're going to want more than that, considering how many players are on expiring contracts. And then next year, things get really, really interesting because Auston Matthews and William Nylander are up next year. Does Matthews get a raise? Then becomes the question. Because this is the thing. 60 goals last year, 40 goals this year, so that's 100 goals over 2 seasons. I always get a kick out of seeing people say that he didn't play well this year. He only had 40 goals. Okay. So it's one of those things that I see and I'm thinking, wow, that's when you know the bar's really high. And I've said that with Matthews before. When a 40-goal season is seen as a crap year and what's wrong with him, you know you've arrived. So against Florida, as I mentioned, Matthews didn't have goals. So how much is Matthews worth next year? And of course, I've already seen all the Arizona memes. We already know that, Arizona would be all in 2024 to bring in Matthews if he were available. It would work on a lot of levels from a marketing perspective and everything, of course. Local boy coming home and is still in his prime, too. So there's a lot to be discussed, but the contracts, I mean, paying these 4 guys big money, it's fine, but the problem is that they haven't won in the playoffs. So that's what makes this stand out. If this was a team that had won a couple of Stanley Cups, or even if they'd been to a Stanley Cup final, I don't think people would harp on the contracts as much. I'm not saying they wouldn't, I'm saying as much. Matthews, $11.64 million cap hit through next year. Tavares, $11 million cap hit until 2025. So Tavares is up in 2 years. I've seen a lot of comments on whether or not they should trade Tavares. I will say this. I remember at the time they signed Tavares being kind of confused because I felt like they needed a top-notch defenseman like an Erik Karlsson, who was, I think he was on the market at the same time. I think they signed the same summer. Don't quote me on that. They'll quote me on that. But yeah, I felt like it was kind of an odd direction to go in to pick up Tavares. It bumped down Kadri to the number 3 center spot. I thought Kadri belonged as the number 2 center. Of course, now they've traded out Kadri. And it's just, none of it's ended up working out as expected. So Tavares, I do think that if there's a new GM, you'd be looking to trade him. I don't know if Kyle Dubas is going to touch the core 4, though. If Dubas sticks around, he has said, he's promised these guys he's going to keep them together. Marner, $10.9 million till 2025, so he's up in 2 years. Nylander, $6.96 million cap hit, and that's why Nylander is always the one that's talked about as being the most likely to be traded. His contract is the easiest of the 4 to trade. Although Marner, I think, would generate a ton of interest, and I've seen Leaf fans saying, let's trade Marner. I would take Marner on any team I cheer for right away. I think that Marner's fantastic. If the Leafs make him available, absolutely. I think he would thrive. I don't know if it's Toronto. So one thing with, and I've talked about this with Canadian markets, there's definitely more pressure on Canadian teams. There's definitely a higher expectation of Canadian teams. And so I sometimes wonder if that does affect their performance and does affect the net results at the end of the year. I don't there's it's one of those things you can't prove, but it does feel like there's some impact with that, right? And so I think some of these players might play better elsewhere, and of course that would just really change that narrative probably for the worse, because then it becomes, so let's say Matthews goes to Arizona and they win. Well, then the narrative isn't Matthews can't win, it's just Toronto can't win. Then that's a whole other thing, which is out there too, but the blame wouldn't necessarily just be on the core four then. It would be on just the Leafs in general. Riley, $7.5 million cap hit. That's until 2030. I have no problem with Riley's cap hit. I think Morgan Riley's overrated by some, underrated by others. The reality is, I think he's one of the better defensemen in the NHL. Not in the same category as Norris winners, but you can't all be Norris winners. And so Matt Murray's $4.68 million cap hit is for one more year. I think they find somewhere to park that contract because they need cap space in order to replenish their ranks, either by re-signing guys or going out and finding somebody else. And then I wanted to put Wall's contract up there. He's only paid $766,000. That's his cap hit until 2025. So if they do decide to make Wall one of their top two goalies and Murray moves out, you're saving about $4 million in cap space right there. The one thing with Toronto is that I'm not saying that the players on this team don't get paid market value. They do. But this is a team where when you look at these contracts, they haven't given the team a discount. We talk about discounts being given out by players in Boston. To some extent, Connor McDavid did that with the Oilers as well. He could have got more money. And it doesn't feel like those same discounts have been provided to the Leafs by their core players. And so here we are, right? They do have Boston's first round draft pick this year, so it's not like they don't have a first rounder. They have their own fifth and their own sixth, and that's it. They don't have any other draft picks. And the 2025 first they've traded to Chicago is top 10 protected. They have their own first round draft pick next year. I've also seen comments along the lines of they need to go all in next year. They went all in. This was all in. They went out. They got O'Reilly. Didn't work. They went out. They got Shen. They got Gustafsson. They went all in. They traded out draft picks. It did not work. They went all in last year too. This is a team that needs to figure this out. And I don't know if the solutions are going to come from within. I don't know if we're going to see a guy like Amirov who's gone through health issues. Maybe Amirov comes in and he's a great story and he really hits with the Leafs and he's a catalyst for this team getting over the hump in their next attempt at the playoffs. But while I had hoped that getting to round two might end these narratives, because of the fact they went out in game 5 against a Florida team that is perceived as being below them. I've said before, and I'll say it again, Florida won the President's Trophy last year. They were a very good team that underachieved through most of the season, bafflingly so. This run in the playoffs is more reflective of what they were last year and not so much what they were the first half of this season. They finished the season very strong as well. So, what do the Leafs do? Do they fire Keefe? Do they get rid of Dubas? Do they extend Dubas for a long-term extension and keep Keefe? What do they do? Who do you trade? So if you're in charge, who do you trade and how do you change this so that next year I'm talking about the Leafs being in the final or I'm talking about the Leafs being in the conference finals. The Leafs getting to the conference finals was a thing not that, at least for me, it's not that long ago. For some of you weren't alive at the time, but I can remember the Leafs being in the conference finals. I can remember the excitement around Toronto. It would be fun to see that again. When the channel came into existence in 2016, I was your standard West Coast Leafs hater. There are a lot of Leafs haters in the West Coast. Standard. Absolutely standard. But over all of this time of me watching Toronto, I have grown just as frustrated as many of the fans watching. I'm not going to say as frustrated as the most frustrated Leaf fans, because I guarantee there's fans more frustrated. But it's tough because this is a talented team. It's a deep team. All the elements are there to have success, but they don't. And for years now, they've been trying to figure out how to find it. And so here we are. Let me know your thoughts. It is always interesting to me how the Leafs losing out in the playoffs ends up being the longest video that I do. And it's not because it's a Toronto video. It is because this team is the most interesting team that can't get over the hump. There's no team in the league that's more interesting that just can't get over the hump, because what the Leafs have done No other team in the league has been this good for this long and just not been able to get over that playoff hurdle. We've seen teams come and go and mediocre and then really good and all this, but the Leafs have been consistently good during the regular season. Postseason, it just kind of falls apart. So let me know your thoughts. How do you fix it? I'd be interested to know the thoughts of Leaf fans out there. How do you? And I'm not nothing crazy and not just blow it all up, but how do you fix this? Because there's something good here, but where does that blame go? Where does that blame go? And how does it get fixed? Remember, the salary cap goes up a lot in 2024. It does not this summer. So they're going to have to get creative. But let me know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe. If you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.